always prided herself on keeping her life organized, her business accounts neatly managed, her personal finances carefully tracked, and her late mother's heirloom jewelry stored in a velvet-lined box at the back of her wardrobe. It was a rainy Tuesday morning when she sat at her kitchen counter with a cup of coffee, opening her laptop to check her bank statement. The numbers on the screen didn't make sense. She stared for a long moment, blinking, convinced she must have misread. Several large withdrawals had been made over the past 2 weeks, each in neat, rounded sums. She frowned, scrolling back through the transactions, her heart picking up speed. There were no receipts, no reminders of purchases that could explain them. She knew every cent she spent, and this wasn't her doing. At first, she told herself it must be an error, a glitch from the bank's side, maybe a double charge or some clerical mistake. It wasn't unusual for accounts to have small hiccups. Still, a prickle of unease settled in her chest. She made a mental note to call the bank after breakfast, trying to push the thought aside as she buttered a slice of toast. But when she walked to her bedroom to grab her phone, she paused at the wardrobe. Something made her open the door, her fingers reaching for the small wooden box hidden behind folded sweaters. Her breath caught the moment the lid lifted. The familiar shimmer of her mother's gold bracelet, the one she used to wear at every family gathering, was gone. So was the matching necklace and the delicate pair of earrings her mother had gifted her on her 18th birthday. For a second, Claire stood frozen, her fingers trembling in the empty space where the jewelry had been. A chill ran through her despite the warmth of the room. She tried to remember the last time she had opened the box. Weeks ago, maybe months. Those pieces weren't just ornaments, they were the last physical link to her mother, a woman who had built everything with hard work and had passed away far too soon. Claire had promised herself she would protect them, just as her mother had protected her. Now, both her money and her most treasured possessions had vanished. When Daniel walked into the bedroom, adjusting his tie for work, Claire turned to him, her voice tighter than she intended. "Daniel, have you noticed anything strange with our accounts? Or have you seen my mother's jewelry? It's missing." He barely glanced up from the mirror. "Missing? Maybe you misplaced it. You're always moving things around." "I'm serious," she said, following him as he walked toward the closet. "Several large withdrawals from our account, and now the jewelry is gone. This isn't a coincidence." Daniel gave a short laugh, the kind that sounded more dismissive than amused. "Claire, you're overthinking again. You do this whenever something feels slightly off. You get attached to these material things and spin yourself into a panic." Her pulse spiked at his words. "These aren't just material things, Daniel. They're my mother's legacy. And this is our money, our savings. I know where I keep my things, and I know what's been spent from our account." He turned to face her, his expression softening just enough to make her doubt her own conviction. "Look, maybe there's a bank error. Call them later. But don't work yourself up over something that's probably nothing." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to tell herself it really was nothing, that the jewelry would turn up in some forgotten drawer and the bank would apologize for their mistake. But the pit in her stomach told her otherwise. She had learned to trust her instincts in business, and those same instincts were whispering now. Something was wrong, and she was being told not to see it. Claire stood by the window after Daniel left for work, staring at the raindrops racing down the glass. Her reflection looked back at her, pale and tense. The thought she had tried to ignore all morning pressed harder into her mind. Money didn't just disappear. Heirloom gold didn't just vanish. And if she didn't start looking for answers now, she might lose more than just things. She might lose the truth itself. The seed of doubt was planted, and no matter how much she tried to bury it, Claire knew it was going to grow. The next few days, Claire tried to live as if nothing had happened. She told herself she would give the bank a few more days to sort out the unexplained withdrawals, and that maybe the jewelry would turn up in some unlikely place. She kept busy with work, answering emails, arranging shipments, and meeting clients. On the surface, everything was normal. But beneath that thin layer of routine, her mind kept circling back to the missing money and her mother's heirlooms. On Thursday afternoon, she stopped by Daniel's parents' house to drop off a package Margaret had asked her to collect from the post office. The front door was unlocked, as usual, and she stepped inside, calling out a greeting. There was no answer at first, but then she heard the faint murmur of a voice coming from the kitchen. It was Margaret, speaking on the phone. Claire was about to make her presence known when the tone of Margaret's voice made her pause. "Yes, the money's already handled," Margaret said, her voice low but urgent. "You'll get it by the end of the week. I told you not to worry." Claire's heart skipped. She stayed still, pretending to adjust her scarf in the hallway, straining to hear more. Margaret continued, "No, it's not from Daniel. Just trust me. I have it covered." The call ended quickly, and moments later, Margaret walked into the hall, smiling as if nothing had happened. "Oh, Claire! I didn't hear you come in. Thank you for bringing this," she said, taking the package. Claire forced a polite smile, but her mind was racing. Money that's already handled. Not from Daniel. What money? She didn't ask right then. She wasn't ready for confrontation without more proof. Instead, she made small talk for a few minutes before leaving, all the while feeling the edges of suspicion sharpen. Driving home, she began recalling little moments she had ignored before. Margaret's casual questions about the business's monthly earnings, her offers to help manage some of Claire's investments, the way she once joked about how lucky Claire was to have both beauty and assets. At the time, it had seemed harmless, even flattering in a strange way. Now those remarks felt different, like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't realized she was assembling. That evening, Claire mentioned the phone call to Daniel, careful to keep her voice neutral. She was talking about some money being handled, and it sounded odd. "Do you know if she's dealing with something big right now?" Daniel frowned, leaning back on the couch. "Claire, you're reading too much into it. My mom helps out a lot of people. Maybe she was just talking about paying someone back or lending them a hand." "It didn't sound like that," Claire said, meeting his eyes. "And you know how much money we're missing. Don't you think it's worth asking her?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "You're not seriously suggesting my mother had anything to do with that. She's not the kind of person who would steal from her own family." "I'm not accusing her," Claire replied softly, though she knew part of her already was. "I'm just saying there are too many coincidences." He sighed and turned back to the television, ending the conversation without another word. Claire sat in silence, feeling the invisible wall that had begun to rise between them. It wasn't a dramatic shift, no shouting, no slammed doors, but it was there, subtle and steady. She could feel it in the way Daniel avoided her gaze, in how their conversation stayed on safe topics, in the quiet space between them at night. For the first time since their wedding, Claire felt alone in her own marriage. And the more she thought about it, the more she knew this wasn't just about missing money or jewelry anymore. Something deeper was beginning to fracture, and if she didn't find out the truth soon, the crack might split their lives apart. Claire decided she couldn't wait for answers to fall into her lap. If Daniel wouldn't help her ask the questions, she would have to find the truth herself. She didn't announce her plan, didn't even hint at it during their morning conversations. Outwardly, she kept up the rhythm of her days. Client meetings, inventory checks, casual dinners at home, but inside, her focus shifted entirely. Every encounter with Margaret became a quiet observation. It didn't take long for small things to catch her attention. Margaret, who usually dressed in simple blouses and carried the same worn leather handbag for years, was suddenly sporting a designer purse Claire knew cost more than a month's rent for some people. There was also the gold necklace, a thick, glossy chain that gleamed in the sunlight when they met for coffee one afternoon. Claire had never seen it before, and she knew the kind of money it would take to buy it. Margaret chattered on about neighborhood gossip, but Claire found her eyes drawn again and again to the bag resting on the table and the way the necklace settled perfectly against her collarbone. She wondered if Daniel had noticed. Then she remembered how quickly he had dismissed her concerns before and decided not to ask. A week later, Margaret invited Claire over for tea, claiming she wanted to show her a set of antique china she had bought at an auction. Claire accepted, though her real reason for going was different. She wanted to look around to see if she could find anything that connected Margaret to the missing money and jewelry. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and furniture polish. Margaret was in the kitchen, arranging biscuits on a plate, and Claire used the moment to wander down the hall. She entered the study, a room filled with bookshelves, framed certificates, and an old oak desk. She ran her fingers along the edge of the desk, pulling gently at one of the drawers. It slid open easily, revealing stacks of old bills and pens. The next drawer was locked. Her pulse quickened. She crouched down, examining the small brass lock. Why would Margaret need to lock one drawer in a desk that otherwise held harmless clutter? Claire glanced toward the kitchen, listening for the clink of teacups. She tried pulling again, as if persistence might make the lock give way, but it held firm. Just as she straightened, she heard footsteps approaching. She quickly stepped away from the desk, pretending to admire a framed photograph on the wall. Margaret appeared in the doorway, holding the plate of biscuits. "Found your way into my study, have you?" she said with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Claire forced a small laugh. "Just looking around. I always forget how cozy this room is." They moved back to the living room. But the image of that locked drawer stayed fixed in Claire's mind. She couldn't shake the thought that something important was inside, something Margaret didn't want her to see. As she drove home later, the conflict inside her deepened. This was Daniel's mother, a woman who had been part of her life since the day she got engaged. She had been there for holidays, birthdays, and the quiet in-between days. Claire didn't want to believe she was capable of stealing from her. But the missing savings, the heirlooms, the sudden purchases, and now that drawer, it was too much to dismiss. The loyalty she felt toward her family warred with the need for the truth. And though she didn't want to admit it yet, she knew the balance was beginning to tip. It was a bright Friday morning when Claire drove into town for a scheduled meeting with one of her suppliers. The sun was warm against the windshield, and she tried to focus on the order details in her folder, rather than the thoughts that had been circling in her head for days. After the meeting ended, she decided to take a short walk before heading back to the car. The air felt lighter, the streets busier, and shop windows glinted in the sunlight. She was passing a small pawn shop she rarely noticed when something in the display caught her eye. At first, it was just a flicker of gold among the other trinkets. Then she stopped, her breath stilled. Behind the glass, resting on a dark velvet pad, was a delicate gold bracelet, its chain thin but strong, with a single oval charm etched with tiny floral patterns. Claire knew every line of that charm. She had touched it 1,000 times while holding her mother's hand as a child. Her feet carried her inside before she could think. The shop smelled faintly of metal and dust, and the man behind the counter looked up from a ledger with a polite nod. Claire pointed toward the window. "That gold bracelet? How long have you had it?" The shopkeeper stepped over, lifting it carefully from the display. "Came in about 2 weeks ago," he said, glancing at a tag. "Lovely piece. I don't see many like this anymore." Claire's voice tightened. "Do you remember who brought it in?" He gave her a quick, assessing look, as if weighing whether to answer. "I keep records for all transactions. The woman who sold it was, let's see." He flipped through a small binder behind the counter. Middle-aged, well-dressed, short blonde hair, wore a pearl brooch. Name she gave was Margaret Hayes. The name landed like a stone in Claire's chest. She managed to keep her expression neutral, even as her pulse pounded in her ears. "May I?" "Take a look at the receipt, just for curiosity's sake." The man hesitated, then held it up for her to see without handing it over. She quickly pulled out her phone, snapping a discreet photo when he turned to set the bracelet back down. "Thank you," she said softly, stepping toward the door. Her fingers itched to hold the bracelet, to take it back home where it belonged, but she knew she couldn't yet, not without making Margaret aware of what she knew. Evidence first, confrontation later. Once outside, Claire leaned against the brick wall of the building, her phone still warm in her hand. She opened the photo of the receipt, staring at the scrawled signature and the date that confirmed it had been sold after her savings had started disappearing. Her hands trembled, not from anger, but from the cold clarity of realization. She might actually be right. The walk back to her car felt longer than before. Every sound around her seemed sharper. The hum of traffic, the chatter of passers-by, the faint hiss of a coffee machine from a nearby cafe. In her mind, each step forward was heavier with the weight of what she now knew. Margaret hadn't just been buying new things. She had been selling off what wasn't hers. Claire started the engine and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. A part of her still wanted to believe there was another explanation, that maybe Margaret had found the bracelet somewhere and decided to sell it without realizing its value. But deep down, she knew that was wishful thinking. This was no accident. As she drove home, the evidence safely stored in her phone, Claire felt a new determination take root. The days of doubting herself were over. Now, it was only a matter of finding enough proof so that even Daniel couldn't deny what was happening right under their noses. Claire waited until dinner that evening to bring it up. She had rehearsed the words in her head during the drive home, trying to keep them calm and measured, but the truth sat in her chest like a stone. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, when she placed her own phone in front of him. The photo of the pawn shop receipt filled the screen. He looked down, frowning. "What's this?" "It's from the pawn shop in town," Claire said, her voice steady but low. "That's my mother's bracelet, Daniel. The shopkeeper remembered exactly who sold it. Your mother. Her name's on the receipt." Daniel blinked, as if she had spoken in another language. "You're saying my mom stole it?" "I'm saying she sold it," Claire replied, keeping her tone even. "And it went missing from my jewelry box around the same time as the money in our account started disappearing. Doesn't that seem like too much to be a coincidence?" He pushed the phone back toward her, leaning back in his chair. "This is ridiculous. My mom wouldn't take from you, Claire. You've probably misplaced it, and now you're looking for someone to blame." Claire felt heat rise in her chest. "Misplaced it? I've worn that bracelet on special occasions my entire life. It never left my jewelry box until it disappeared, and this isn't about losing something. It's about the fact she's been making expensive purchases while our money has been vanishing." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "You've had a problem with her for months now, always thinking she's too involved in our lives, too curious about your business. Now you're trying to turn me against her." Her stomach twisted. "I'm trying to protect what's ours. You think I want this? That I want to believe your mother is capable of this?" She shook her head, fighting to keep her voice from breaking. "I've been giving her the benefit of the doubt while watching our savings disappear." Daniel stood, running a hand through his hair. "You're letting your paranoia ruin this marriage. She's my mother. She raised me. I'm not going to accuse her without solid proof." Claire stared at him, stunned. "I just gave you proof. A receipt. A shopkeeper who remembers her. What more do you need?" He didn't answer, just walked past her toward the living room. The sound of the television switching on filled the silence like a wall slamming shut between them. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment, staring at the half-finished dinner on the table, her appetite gone. The hurt was sharp, but beneath it was something colder, resolve. If Daniel wouldn't believe her now, she would have to find proof so undeniable it couldn't be ignored. That night, she lay awake beside him, listening to his slow breathing, the distance between them more than the space in the bed. This was the first time she could feel a real crack in their marriage, a fracture that might never fully close. And yet, in the quiet darkness, she made herself a promise. She would keep searching, no matter how much it cost her. Claire knew she couldn't confront Margaret again without something so solid, so undeniable, that even Daniel would have to face it. That meant getting closer, watching more carefully, and, if she could, finding where Margaret kept her most guarded possessions. It was during an unplanned visit to drop off some fabric samples that she found herself chatting with Rosa, the housekeeper who had worked for Margaret for years. Rosa was kind, soft-spoken, and seemed genuinely fond of Claire. They were sitting at the kitchen counter while Margaret was out shopping when Rosa mentioned how much harder it had been to clean the bedroom lately. "Why's that?" Claire asked casually, stirring the tea Rosa had offered. "Oh, it's that new safe she had installed in the closet," Rosa said with a shrug. "Big, heavy thing. I have to dust around it every week. She told me not to touch it." Claire kept her expression neutral, but inside her pulse jumped. A safe in the closet. She almost asked more, but she didn't want to raise suspicion. Instead, she smiled and changed the subject. Still, the information lodged firmly in her mind. A week later, she saw her chance. Margaret was attending a charity luncheon across town, and Daniel was at work. Claire told herself she was only going to confirm what Rosa had said, but in truth, she already knew she would do more. She arrived at the house with a tin of muffins as her excuse, setting them on the counter before heading straight for the bedroom. The closet was neat, clothes arranged by color and season. In the far corner, half hidden behind a row of dresses, stood a matte black safe about the size of a small suitcase. Her heart hammered as she crouched in front of it. She didn't know the code, but the safe door was ajar, just enough for her to pull it open. The sight inside stole her breath. Stacks of cash, bound with rubber bands, filled one side. On the other, there was a folder stuffed with papers. She pulled it out, flipping quickly through receipts from various pawn shops and gold dealers, each listing items that matched descriptions of her mother's jewelry. Her hands shook as she reached deeper and found a small velvet pouch. She opened it and stared at the familiar gleam of her mother's rings, the ones she thought she would never see again. Claire forced herself to act fast. She took out her phone and snapped photo after photo of the cash, the receipts, the rings. She zoomed in on dates, amounts, and Margaret's signature on the sales slips. Every click of the camera felt like another nail in the coffin of any excuse Daniel might try to make. Carefully, she put everything back exactly as she had found it and closed the safe door. She smoothed the dresses back into place, took a deep breath, and walked out of the room. By the time she reached her car, her hands were cold despite the warm afternoon sun. Sitting behind the wheel, she opened the photo gallery on her phone. The images stared back at her. Crisp, clear, undeniable. This was it. The truth laid bare. No more guessing, no more doubt. She had the proof, and there was no going back. But as she drove away, a heavy weight settled in her chest. Having the truth didn't erase the pain of it. It didn't change that the woman she had once called family had stolen from her, or that the man she loved had chosen not to believe her. And now, with the evidence in her hands, she knew the next step would break everything wide open. Claire didn't sleep much the night after finding the safe. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her phone on the nightstand like a loaded weapon. The photos she had taken burned in her mind, proof that could no longer be ignored. By morning, she knew what she had to do. She drove to the police station with her hands tight on the steering wheel, her heart steady but heavy. Inside, she asked to speak to an officer in private. At first, they listened politely, but when she slid her phone across the desk and the images filled the screen, their expressions changed. She explained each photo, the receipts, the cash, the jewelry, and detailed the missing funds from her account. The officer took notes, asked questions, and by the end of the hour, assured her they would move forward immediately. 2 days later, the knock came on Margaret's door. Claire was in her car at the end of the street, watching from a distance. The afternoon sun was bright, glinting off the police cruiser that had just pulled up. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains and stepped out onto porches as 2 officers approached the house. Margaret opened the door, smiling as if expecting a visitor, but her face stiffened when they introduced themselves. "What is this about?" she demanded, glancing around at the gathering onlookers. One officer calmly explained that she was under investigation for theft and fraud. When they mentioned Claire's name, Margaret's eyes widened in fury. "This is her doing, that ungrateful girl, after everything I've done for her," she shouted, her voice carrying down the street. The officers asked her to step outside. Margaret tried to argue, her voice rising, but they were firm. Soon she was being led to the car, her wrists cuffed, her shouts turning into accusations hurled in every direction. "She's lying. She's poisoning my son against me." Claire stayed in her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she watched. A part of her wanted to get out, to tell Margaret to her face that she had done this to herself. But she didn't move. This was no longer about words. It was about consequences. By the next morning, the story had already hit local news. A respected community member arrested for stealing from her own daughter-in-law. Photos of Margaret being escorted into the police car were plastered online, and the comment sections were filled with shock, speculation, and judgment. At the grocery store, Claire felt eyes on her, heard the hushed voices in the next aisle. Some people offered her sympathetic glances. Others looked at her as if she had exposed a dirty secret they would have preferred to ignore. Daniel didn't speak to her that night. He came home late, went straight to the bedroom, and shut the door. The silence between them was colder than any argument. Claire sat alone in the kitchen, the weight of what she had done pressing down on her, not with regret, but with the knowledge that nothing in their family would ever be the same again. The truth was out. Margaret was behind bars. And now, Claire would have to face the wreckage left in the wake of justice. The days after the arrest were a blur of phone calls, tense silences, and the constant hum of gossip that seemed to follow Claire wherever she went. Daniel's family reacted quickly, and not in her favor. His older sister, Melissa, called the very next morning, her voice sharp enough to cut. "Do you have any idea what you've done to this family? You humiliated us in front of the whole town." She didn't wait for an answer before hanging up. Others were less direct, but no less hurtful. A cousin posted a vague message online about people airing private matters instead of handling them like adults, which was quickly liked by half the family. Even Daniel's father, who had never been particularly close to her, sent a short text. "You could have handled this differently." But there were also quieter voices. Daniel's aunt, Evelyn, called one evening to say she had seen Margaret's spending spiral out of control for months. "I'm not saying it's easy," Evelyn said gently, "but you did what you had to do." Her words were kind, but they felt like a drop of warmth in an ocean of cold. That coldness was worst at home. Daniel spoke to her only when necessary, his tone flat, his eyes avoiding hers. He no longer asked about her day, no longer lingered in the kitchen to chat while she cooked. The bed felt bigger at night, the space between them on the mattress turning into a quiet void. One evening, she tried to bridge the distance. "Daniel, we can't keep living like this. I didn't want any of this to happen, but your mother stole from us. I had proof." He didn't look up from the paperwork he was pretending to read. "You had your version of proof," he said. "I'm still not convinced this couldn't have been resolved without involving the police." Claire's chest tightened. "Resolved? She emptied our account, Daniel. She sold my mother's jewelry. What would you have me do? Ask her nicely to give it back and pretend nothing happened?" He finally met her eyes, and the expression there was worse than anger. It was disappointment. "You could have trusted me to handle it." She wanted to scream, to remind him that she had tried, that she had come to him first and he had turned her away. But she swallowed the words, knowing they would only harden the wall between them. In the quiet that followed, Claire began to understand something she hadn't before. This wasn't just about his mother's actions or her decision to go to the police. This was about loyalty, about which side Daniel had chosen to stand on, and it wasn't hers. As she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, she asked herself the question she had been avoiding since this began. Could their marriage survive this storm, or had the crack already split them apart for good? The court moved faster than Claire expected. Within a week, Margaret was officially charged with theft, fraud, and possession of stolen property. The judge denied her bail, citing the risk of further asset concealment. It was the kind of decision Claire had thought she wanted, a clear acknowledgement from the legal system that Margaret was guilty. But when the news reached her, there was no surge of triumph, only a deep, quiet heaviness that settled in her chest. Friends and acquaintances sent her messages of support. Some congratulated her for standing up for herself, calling her brave. At the coffee shop, an old neighbor leaned in and whispered, "Good for you, dear. Some people need to learn there are consequences." Claire smiled politely, but the words felt hollow. It wasn't victory she was tasting. It was ash. At night, sleep refused to come. She would lie in the dark beside Daniel, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, wondering if he was really asleep or simply pretending to avoid conversation. On the nights he came home late, she sat alone in the living room, replaying every choice she had made since the first missing withdrawal. The logic still held. Margaret had stolen from her, and she had proof, but the personal cost kept gnawing at her. Daniel barely spoke about the case now. When he did, his words were clipped, factual, stripped of any warmth. "The next hearing's in 2 weeks," he said one evening, not looking up from his laptop. Claire nodded, feeling the distance between them stretch further. She wanted to tell him how tired she was of the silence, how much she missed the ease they used to share, but the fear of pushing him further away kept her quiet. Her work suffered too. Orders were late, emails unanswered. She caught herself staring out of the shop window for long minutes, her mind wandering to the same question over and over. Had she fought so hard for justice that she'd sacrificed her marriage in the process? One afternoon, as she left the grocery store, she saw Evelyn again. The older woman touched her arm gently and said, "I know it's hard, but the truth matters, even if it costs you." Claire nodded, managing a faint smile. She knew Evelyn meant well, but the words only deepened the ache in her chest. That night, she sat on the couch with her phone in her hand, scrolling through the folder of evidence she had once guarded like treasure. The photos of the safe, the receipts, the jewelry, they were still proof, still irrefutable, but now they felt like a weight she had to carry alone. She had won in the eyes of the law, but in her home, it felt like she was losing everything that mattered most. And as she turned off the lamp and the living room fell into darkness, Claire realized she didn't know what the real price of justice would be until this was all over, if it ever truly would be. Months passed before the trial reached its end. The courthouse was packed the day the sentence was read, the air heavy with the quiet murmur of onlookers and the clicking of reporters' cameras. Margaret sat at the defense table in a pale suit, her face set in a mask that revealed nothing. Claire didn't look at her, keeping her eyes fixed on the judge as the charges were read aloud one final time. The sentence was firm: several years in prison, restitution to be paid in full. The gavel came down, and just like that, the case was over. Margaret's expression cracked for the first time, her mouth tightening, but she didn't turn toward Claire. 2 officers led her away, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Afterward, Claire stepped outside into the crisp evening air, the courthouse steps buzzing with voices. She had expected to feel relief, even vindication. Instead, there was only a hollow space where the anger had once lived. She spotted Daniel standing at the edge of the crowd, hands in his pockets, his gaze shifting uneasily when their eyes met. They walked together to a quieter corner of the square. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Daniel exhaled slowly. "I didn't want to believe it," he said, his voice low. "Even when you showed me the photos, a part of me thought there had to be another explanation. But after hearing everything in court, she did it. She really did." Claire studied him, searching for some sign of the man she had married, the partner who used to meet her halfway. "And now?" she asked quietly. He shook his head, eyes down. "Now? I don't know. I can't undo how I treated you. I can't pretend the things I said didn't hurt you. But I also don't know if we can go back to what we were before all this." The truth of it stung, even though she had already felt the same. "Neither do I," she admitted. "I didn't want to lose us, Daniel, but I couldn't let her take from me and do nothing. That's not who I am." They stood there in the fading light, the sounds of the city moving on around them. After a moment, Daniel gave a small nod, as if accepting something he couldn't change. "Maybe we both need time," he said. Claire didn't argue. Time was the only thing left to offer. She took a step back, then another, her heels clicking softly on the pavement. He didn't follow, and she didn't look back. The evening air was cool against her face, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves. She felt lighter with each step, as though a weight had been lifted, but the emptiness in her chest remained. She had fought for justice and won, but the victory had come with a cost she couldn't yet measure. As she reached the end of the street, Claire realized she didn't know if this was the end of the war or just the closing of its first battle. All she knew was that, for now, she was walking forward, alone but unbroken.